There's a special kind of phrase that the English language seems to have invented specifically to break people's hearts in the most polite way possible. You're like a brother to me. I heard it on a Tuesday evening, at the Bobcat coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Maple, accompanied by the espresso machine which, at that very moment, made a sound eerily similar to the groan of a dying whale. I've often thought since that the barista did it on purpose. Cosmic humor, delivered through professional equipment. My name is Daniel Carter. My friends call me Dan. At the time, I was 26, working as a graphic designer, renting an apartment with a view of a parking lot, and completely, hopelessly, idiotically in love with the girl sitting across from me who had just called me her brother. The girl's name was Emma Reyes. We'd been friends for 4 years. 4 years is, when you think about it, a very long time. In 4 years, you can get a college degree. You can raise a child to the age where they start asking uncomfortable questions. You can, theoretically, build a house. And in 4 years, I had built only one thing, a gigantic, carefully reinforced, architecturally complex edifice of unspoken feelings. And now Emma Reyes, with one phrase about being a brother, had just launched a wrecking ball into its foundation. "Dan," said Emma, tilting her head, "you zoned out. You have that look like someone just told you coffee has been canceled forever." "I didn't zone out," I said, zoning out even harder. For context, 10 minutes earlier, I had finally, after 4 years, 2 false starts, and 1 motivational speech I delivered to myself in the car in the parking lot, worked up the courage. I told Emma I had something to tell her. I said that these 4 years had been the best thing that ever happened to me. I said, and I'm proud that my voice only cracked twice, that my feelings for her went beyond friendship. And Emma looked at me with her big dark eyes, in which the coffee shop's string lights were reflected, and delivered the great speech. The great speech about friendship is a genre. It has rules, like a sonnet. First comes the preamble. "Dan, you're such a wonderful person." Then the main body. "You mean so much to me, you're always there, I can tell you anything." And then the final, crushing chord. "And that's exactly why I can't risk our friendship. You're like a brother to me. I don't want to ruin what we have." I listened to the great speech to the end. I even nodded at the appropriate moments, because I'm a polite person, and also because if I hadn't nodded, I would have had to say something, and at that moment, I was about as capable of speaking as that dying whale from the espresso machine. "I understand," I said finally, and that was the pure truth. I did understand. I understood far too much. I understood, for example, that right now I needed to stand up, walk to my car, drive home, and then calmly die of embarrassment in a private setting. "We're still friends, right?" asked Emma, and there was real anxiety in her voice. "Dan, please, tell me nothing's going to change between us." And that's where I made my main mistake of the evening. I looked into those anxious dark eyes, and did what I'd been doing for the last 4 years, reflexively, like breathing. I said what she wanted to hear. "Of course," I said. "Of course we're still friends. Nothing's going to change." Emma beamed, as if I'd lifted a bag of cement off her shoulders, reached across the table, and squeezed my hand. "You're the best, Dan," she said. "Seriously, the absolute best. The absolute best. A brother, a friend." I had collected the full set of consolation prizes, and hadn't won the main one. "You told her nothing's going to change." Marcus looked at me as if I'd just confessed to eating soup with a fork. "Dan, Daniel, my friend, you're an idiot." Marcus Webb is my best friend from college. He works as a nurse in the ICU, which means he has nerves of steel, a very dark sense of humor, and zero patience for human stupidity, of which, he says, he's seen enough to last 3 lifetimes. We were sitting in my kitchen. It was Thursday. 2 days had passed since the great speech, and I'd spent those 2 days in a state that my neighbor would probably have described as quiet and suspiciously still. "What was I supposed to say?" I asked. "The truth," Marcus threw up his hands. Something like, "Emma, with all due respect, I just opened my chest for you, and you offered to tape it shut with a Band-Aid that says, bro. I need to go rethink my life." "I can't say that." "Why not?" "Because it's Emma." "Ah," said Marcus. "Right. That explains everything. It's a magic spell. Because it's Emma. You've been using that to justify everything for the last 4 years." The third member of our council, who had been silently and intently eating my chips, finally spoke up. This was Chloe Anderson, a mutual friend of mine and Marcus's, an accountant by profession, and a person who, it sometimes seemed to me, saw right through people like an X-ray machine and compiled detailed spreadsheets on them. "Can I ask something?" said Chloe, not taking her eyes off the chips. "Dan, in those 4 years, did you ever do anything for yourself? Anything that didn't revolve around Emma Reyes and her convenience?" I wanted to say yes. I opened my mouth to say yes. And then I honestly thought about it, and the thought turned out to be rather unpleasant to the touch. I remembered canceling a trip with Marcus to the lake because Emma was going through a hard time and needed to vent. Becoming the designated driver for all her dates, dropping off, picking up, waiting with hot tea and a willingness to hear all about how Brad, or Tyler, or what's his name had once again turned out to be a disappointment. Remembering her schedule better than my own, standing in the corner all evening at her birthday party 2 years ago, watching her dance with other people, and convincing myself that just being near her was happiness enough. "I can see it on your face," Chloe said softly. "Don't bother. It's not like I was a victim," I tried to defend myself. "I liked helping her. Emma's a wonderful person." "No one's arguing she's a wonderful person," said Chloe. "Wonderful people can also, without meaning to, keep someone on a short leash for years. That doesn't make them villains. It makes you a volunteer." Marcus pointed at Chloe with a, "See, listen to the smart woman" expression. "Here's what," he said. "I'm going to write you a prescription, free of charge, as a friend. You stop being the designated driver. You stop dropping everything at the first ring. You, and this is key, start living your own life. Not to spite Emma, not to prove anything to her. Just because, as it turns out, you have a life too, and for the last 4 years it's been sitting idle, like that car in the parking lot you admire from your window." "And what am I supposed to do with this life?" I asked. "To begin with," said Chloe, setting aside the empty chip bowl, "come on Saturday. My colleague's sister is opening a pottery studio. They're having an open house. Free wine, free clay. You'll meet actual human beings who aren't in Emma Reyes' orbit." "Pottery studio," I repeated skeptically. "Pottery studio," Chloe said firmly. "You're going." And since I couldn't come up with a single decent argument against free wine, I went. The pottery studio was called Dirty Hands, and the name turned out to be an extremely honest description of what went on there. The studio occupied a former warehouse, high ceilings, brick walls, large windows, and I, as someone with an eye for visuals, immediately appreciated that the light came in right. Pottery wheels stood everywhere. Shelves groaned under the weight of mugs, bowls, and vases of varying degrees of crookedness, and the air smelled of wet clay, coffee, and that particular scent of paint and enthusiasm that only exists in places where people make things with their hands. Chloe immediately dissolved into the crowd of acquaintances. Marcus found the wine table and took up a position of strategic importance beside it, and I was left standing in the middle of the studio with a glass in my hand, feeling about as organic as a penguin on a tennis court. And then I heard a laugh, not a polite social chuckle, a real laugh, loud, coming from somewhere deep, with a little snort at the end, completely devoid of self-consciousness. I turned toward the sound. Behind the nearest pottery wheel sat a woman, laughing at the object in her hands. The object, as far as I could tell, was intended to be a mug. But during the creative process, the mug had made some kind of independent decision, and now most closely resembled a small ceramic result of an earthquake. "This," said the woman, catching my eye and holding up her creation higher so I could see it better, "is a mug, officially. I insist on this definition. It's," I searched for the word, "expressive." Expressive is very tactful. The woman set the mug on the table, where it wobbled slightly, as if agreeing that its fate was complicated. "You can say it straight. It's ugly. I made it 10 minutes ago, and I already love it precisely for that reason. It's my little ugly triumph." The woman had short, dark hair, a nose smudged with clay, and a completely open, nothing-hidden smile. She was wearing overalls that had seen better days, and, judging by their look, were very happy about it. "I'm Dan," I said. "Sophie," she said. "Sophie Bennett. I'd shake your hand, but—" She showed me her palms, covered in drying clay. "I'm currently a biological hazard." "Did you come to make pottery, Or did you come for the free wine and moral support? Honestly, my friend dragged me along. I'd say against my will, but there's wine here, so not entirely against. The most honest people are those who came for the wine, Sophie nodded seriously. Sit down. She patted the stool at the neighboring wheel. I'll teach you how to make an ugly mug. It's therapeutic, you know, cheaper than real therapy, and at the end, you have a mug. And I sat down. I don't know why. Maybe it was the laugh. Maybe it was that Sophie Bennett talked to me as if we'd known each other for 100 years, and were just continuing a long-running conversation. Maybe it was that, for the first time in a week, or maybe in 4 years, someone had offered to do something just for the pleasure of it. My mug turned out even worse than Sophie's. Much worse. It tilted sideways on the wheel. I tried to save it. The rescue attempt went poorly. And in the end, the clay got its revenge by splattering all over my sleeve. Sophie laughed so genuinely and contagiously that I unexpectedly started laughing too. At myself, at the mug, at the whole ridiculous situation. You know what I'll tell you, Dan? Said Sophie, examining my ceramic failure. This is the worst mug I've seen today. And I've seen a lot of mugs. But you were laughing for real. So I'm calling this evening a success. I went home with an ugly mug wrapped in newspaper, a stained sleeve, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling in my chest. I think it was called lightness. I hadn't worn it in a long time. Turned out it still fit. Things then began to develop exactly as Marcus had predicted, gradually, and then all at once. I signed up for the pottery studio, permanently. I, Daniel Carter, a man who for 4 years couldn't find time for his own hobbies because all his time went to Emma Reyes's schedule, was now driving to the former warehouse every Wednesday evening and ruining clay for my own enjoyment. And every Wednesday, Sophie was there. It turned out that Sophie Bennett was a veterinarian. She treated, in her own words, anyone with more than 2 legs who can't complain in words. It turned out that at home, she had a 3-legged cat named Pythagoras, because when he sits, he folds into a perfect triangle. I'm not responsible. It turned out that she was a terrible cook, proud of it, knew a lot about bad movies, and believed that any day could be improved by including tacos. It turned out that with Sophie, I didn't need to pretend to be anything, and that was the strangest part. With Emma, I had always been, even if unconsciously, slightly on stage, slightly smarter, slightly more attentive, slightly more patient than I actually was. The best version of myself, rehearsed and presented. But with Sophie, I was just myself, with stupid jokes, crooked mugs, work stories, and Sophie, it seemed, was perfectly fine with that. More than that, she seemed to like it. You seem different today, Chloe told me about a month later, when the 3 of us, Marcus, Chloe, and I, were sitting in our usual diner. Different how? In a good way. Chloe squinted, conducting her signature X-ray inspection. You're taking up more space. Did I gain weight? Not that kind of space, you idiot. She rolled her eyes. Before, you seemed like you were constantly apologizing for existing, shrinking. And now, you're not. She paused. Is it the pottery girl? Sophie and I are just friends, I said automatically. Marcus choked on a French fry. You, he said, coughing. Hear yourself? Just friends. Dan. Those 2 words ruined your life once. Maybe we don't bring them close a second time? That's not what I meant, I protested. I mean, I'm not going to force anything. I just crawled out of a 4-year situation a month ago. Right now, I just feel good. I feel good going to the studio, good laughing, good eating tacos. I don't want to turn everything into a special operation again. Chloe and Marcus exchanged a look. They have this look. Over the years of friendship, they've developed an entire non-verbal language, and this particular look meant something like, he doesn't see it, but we do. What? I asked. Nothing, said Chloe with the smile of a cat who knows where the sour cream is hidden. Eat your burger, Dan. I should tell you about my parents, because without them, this story is incomplete, and also because they'll soon put on a little show. My parents, Richard and Carol Carter, have been married for 31 years, and in that time they've refined the art of family life to the level of a well-rehearsed vaudeville. Dad is a retired history teacher, a man who is fundamentally incapable of telling a short story, and considers any Sunday dinner a convenient podium. Mom is a retired nurse, a woman who sees right through her only son and has a built-in detector that reacts to any attempt by said son to hide anything. Every Sunday, I drove to their house for dinner. It was such an unshakable tradition that you could probably set your watch by it. And then one Sunday, about a month and a half after the pottery studio, I made a tactical error. I mentioned Sophie twice during dinner, just twice. Once in the context of, Sophie told a funny story about a parrot. The second time, Sophie says the best tacos in the city are made at that little diner by the station. Mom put down her fork. When my mother puts down her fork in the middle of dinner, it's an alarm signal on the level of, everyone take their positions according to the emergency protocol. Daniel, she said. Who is Sophie? A friend, I said. From the pottery studio. I see, said Mom. My mother's I see is not an acknowledgement. It's an interrogation packed into 2 syllables. From the pottery studio, Dad repeated, immediately picking up the thread because 31 years of marriage had turned my parents into a well-coordinated investigative team. I didn't know you went to a pottery studio. Since when? Recently. What about Emma? Asked Mom. And that's when I realized dinner had officially turned into a court hearing. Does Emma go to the studio with you? For context, my parents knew Emma. All 4 years they knew her. Emma had been to a couple of these Sunday dinners, charmed Dad with conversations about history, helped Mom in the kitchen, and my parents, especially Mom, at some point had clearly filed her under potential daughter-in-law, and from time to time subtly highlighted that file for me. No, I said. Emma doesn't go. Emma and we see each other less often now. Silence fell over the table. Dad set aside the historical anecdote about Gettysburg that he'd clearly been holding in reserve. Mom looked at me, and I could almost physically feel her detector working. What happened, Daniel? She asked quietly. And I told her. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was that this was the house I grew up in, or Mom's tone, or simply that I'd been carrying this inside me for too long. But I told her everything. About the 4 years, about the Bobcat coffee shop, about the great speech about friendship, about, you're like a brother to me, about how I'd said, nothing's going to change, and then realized I couldn't do it anymore, and slowly started building a life that had room for me in it. When I finished, the dining room was very quiet, and then my father, soft-spoken, verbose, never raising his voice father, did something I'd probably never seen before. He put both palms on the table, looked at me, and said shortly, without a single historical digression, "Good." "Good?" I repeated. "Good that you figured it out," said Dad. "Son, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to say it once, so listen carefully. Emma's a nice girl, no one's saying she's not, but I spent 4 years watching you go to her, and you know what I saw? I saw a boy who was always waiting for a call, waiting to be noticed, waiting for his turn." He shook his head. "I don't want my son to spend his life in waiting mode. Life isn't a waiting room, Dan." Mom didn't say anything. She just stood up, walked around the table, hugged me from behind around the shoulders, and kissed the top of my head, the way she used to when I was 8 and skinned my knee. Then she straightened up and said in a businesslike tone, "Next Sunday, bring Sophie to dinner." "Mom, we're just friends." "I didn't ask who you are," said Mom, taking my empty plate. "I said, bring Sophie to dinner. I want to see the girl who's made my son smile for the first time in 4 years while talking about parrots." I was very nervous about inviting Sophie. I rehearsed the wording about 15 times. I wanted it to sound as casual as possible, friendly, without subtext. "Hey, my parents are having a Sunday dinner, there's lots of food, and Dad will talk about the Civil War. Want to come?" Sophie listened to my entire carefully casual formulation, tilting her head, and then said, "Dan, you just spent 1 minute and 40 seconds inviting me to dinner. I timed it. You could have done it in 10 seconds. I'd love to come. And for the record, I love the Civil War. I mean, I don't understand anything about it, but I love listening to people who do." I will probably always remember the Sunday dinner with Sophie Bennett. Sophie arrived with flowers for Mom and a bottle of wine for Dad, instantly winning both of them over at the door. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in the kitchen, helping Mom peel potatoes, and knowledgeably discussing which donkey was not smart enough, and which, on the contrary, was too smart. It turned out donkeys are generally intelligent animals. I learned a lot of new things. Another half hour later, she asked Dad a single question about some fort, And Dad, figuratively speaking, burst like a dam. He talked for 40 minutes, and Sophie listened as if it were the best podcast of her life, asking questions at the right moments that made Dad shine like a new dollar. I sat at the table, ate Mom's casserole, and watched all this with a very strange feeling. I suddenly realized that in 4 years, Emma had never fit into my family like this. She had been a polite guest, a good, pleasant, correct guest. But Sophie, in one dinner, had become like a piece that had been missing from this picture all along. They just put it in place, and the picture finally came together. After dinner, when Sophie went out into the yard to look at Dad's tomatoes, Dad grew tomatoes and was willing to talk about them almost as long as about the Civil War. Mom came up to me with a kitchen towel in her hands and stood beside me, looking out the window. "Daniel," she said. That girl watches you." "Of course she watches me, Mom. We're talking." "No." Mom turned to me, and in her gaze was that particular maternal mixture of tenderness and mild irritation I'd known all my life. "She watches you when you're not looking, when you turn away to pour yourself water. I've been watching all dinner." She sighed. "Son, I love you very much. That's why I'm saying this straight, because subtle hints, unfortunately, you inherited from your father, and he didn't pick up on a single hint in 31 years. That girl has feelings for you, and you have feelings for her too. I can see it. Don't do this time what you did for 4 years. Don't wait. Don't overthink. Don't draw your blueprints." I looked out the window. Sophie was standing among Dad's tomatoes. Dad was enthusiastically showing her something, and she laughed. That same laugh, with the snort at the end, that I'd first heard over an ugly mug. And something inside me very quietly, without a crash, clicked into place. Life, of course, wouldn't be life if Emma hadn't called at that exact moment. Almost 2 months had passed since the Bobcat coffee shop and the great speech. In those 2 months, Emma and I had been texting less and less, not because of a fight, but simply because I was no longer the person who was always available, always free, always ready. I wasn't doing it to spite her. I was just busy, with a real, my own, full life, and there was no longer room in it for waiting mode. And then, on Wednesday evening, just as I was about to head to the pottery studio, my phone lit up with the name Emma. "Dan," she said, and her voice was so warm and familiar that for a second, the old reflex pricked at me. "God, it's been so long. I've missed you. Listen, are you free tonight? I thought we could sit, like old times, at the Bobcat, catch up. A year ago, honestly 2 months ago, I would have canceled everything. I would have canceled the studio, canceled my plans, canceled my own birthday if it had fallen on that evening. Of course, Emma. On my way, Emma." "I can't tonight," I said. "I have my pottery class." There was a pause on the line, short, but I heard it. Emma was clearly running through options, because in her worldview, the phrase, "I can't, I have pottery class," from Dan Carter, was something like a report that the sun had decided to rise in the west today. "Pottery class?" she repeated. "Since when do you go to a pottery class?" "Recently. I like it." "Well, after? Maybe after class?" "After class I usually go to dinner, with friends from the studio." Another pause. And in that pause, I could almost physically feel Emma Reyes, slowly realizing that something had changed. That her designated driver, her always available, her reliable as sunrise Dan, was no longer standing in the parking lot with the engine running, waiting for her call. "Oh," said Emma, and then, in a slightly different tone, without the previous lightness, "Is there someone? At that studio?" "There are friends," I said evenly, "and a hobby, and, a life, Emma. I have a life now." "That's great," she said, and I could hear her trying to sound sincere, but it wasn't working very well. "Really, that's great. It's just, I don't know, it's weird. I'm used to you always—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew how it ended. "I'm used to you always being there. I'm used to you always being mine." "I have to go to class," I said gently. "We'll talk later, okay?" And I hung up. And, here's the strangest part, there was no ache in my chest, no triumph, no gloating, no old gnawing longing, just calm. An even, quiet calm of someone who had finally left the waiting room and discovered that outside, it turned out, the weather was beautiful. I was going to confess to Sophie that same evening. I even had a plan. Not a 4-year blueprint with reinforced foundations, but a simple human plan. After the studio, after dinner, I would just tell her, without 40 seconds of rehearsal, without carefully casual formulations. Just say it as it was. But that evening, Sophie didn't stay for dinner. She got an emergency call from the clinic. Some dog had eaten socks, and Sophie, pulling on her jacket, threw over her shoulder, "Sorry, Dan, socks won't wait," and rushed off to save a dog from the consequences of its culinary curiosity. So the confession had to be postponed. And, as it turned out, the universe had its own plans for that evening, far more cinematic than mine. A week later, on Wednesday, after the studio, Sophie and I stepped outside and discovered it was raining. Not a light, pleasant drizzle, but a real downpour. Sheets of rain, theatrical thunderclaps, as if someone upstairs had decided our story was lacking atmosphere. We took shelter under the awning at the studio entrance, just the two of us. The rain roared, pounded on the awning, streamed down, blurring the city lights into watercolor smudges. It smelled of wet asphalt and approaching summer. "Well," said Sophie, surveying the downpour, "this is going to last a while. We can stand here and philosophize. I'm good at philosophizing in the rain. It's seasonal for me." I looked at her, at Sophie Bennett with her clay-smudged hands. Even now, after a shower, there was always clay under her nails, a professional marker. With her short, dark hair, darkened and curled by the humidity, with that open smile that never hid anything. And I realized that waiting for the right moment was just waiting mode again. And I was done with waiting mode. I had checked out of that waiting room. "Sophie," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I'm going to say it straight, without a 40-second preamble, because you'll make fun of me afterward, and I can't handle that twice." Sophie turned to me. The rain roared. She didn't say anything, just looked, and in her eyes was something very attentive and very warm. "The last couple of months have been the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time," I said. "And it's not about the pottery studio. Well, not only about it. It's about you. With you, for the first time in years, I feel like myself. Not the rehearsed version. Not the best friend who's conveniently always available. Just myself. And I like it so much that I don't want to be quiet anymore. I don't want to be just friends with you, Sophie. I mean, I do, but not just. I want everything. I'm in love with you. There, I said it." The rain kept roaring. Sophie was silent for exactly 3 seconds. I counted because those 3 seconds were about as long as a geological era. And then she stepped toward me, took my face in her hands, which still smelled faintly of clay, and said, "Daniel Carter, I've been waiting for you to say that since about the day you ruined your first mug. That was a very long time ago, by the way. I was running out of excuses to keep you at the studio." And then she kissed me, under the awning, to the roar of the downpour. And it was not a consolation prize. It was the main prize. I'll tell just enough about what happened next to remain a gentleman. I'll say that the rain never stopped, and we decided fighting the elements was pointless, and we went to Sophie's. Fortunately, it wasn't far. I'll say that in the hallway, we were met by the 3-legged cat Pythagoras, who looked me up and down, conducted some kind of feline evaluation, and apparently reached a positive verdict, because he graciously rubbed against my leg. I'll say that Sophie's apartment was exactly as I'd imagined its owner. Warm, slightly chaotic, filled with books and crooked ceramic creations, among which I proudly recognized that very first ugly mug. She'd kept it, it turned out, and treasured it. And about the night itself, I'll say only one thing. It was glorious. I'll say there was a lot of laughter, because with Sophie, there's always a lot of laughter. It seems to come with the package. That there wasn't a trace of the awkwardness I'd feared. That at some point we were just lying in the dark, listening to the rain outside catching its breath, and Sophie was tracing her finger on my palm and telling some completely unimportant story about a donkey, and I lay there listening and thought that this, probably, was that very happiness I'd been looking for in the wrong place for 4 years. The details will remain between Sophie and me and, partly, Pythagoras, who spent the whole night pretending to sleep in the armchair, but I could see him peeking. I'll only say that I fell asleep toward morning, absolutely, indecently, stupidly happy, and that waking up next to someone you're comfortable with is, it turns out, not at all the same as waking up next to someone you have to try for. I was naive if I thought the story would end there. happily and neatly, like a closing door. About a month passed. It was a good month, the best. Sophie and I were that insufferable couple who were always giggling at their inside jokes. Mom had already twice, as if in passing, asked if Sophie liked a certain porcelain set that someday should go to Daniel's wife. Marcus said he'd finally stopped worrying about me and would now worry about something else. And Chloe reminded everyone with unbearable smugness that it was she who had brought me to that pottery studio. And then Emma found out. She found out, as these things go, through social media. Sophie posted a photo, the two of us at that very diner with the best tacos by the station, smeared with sauce and completely happy with life, and captioned it with something simple and sweet. And apparently, that photo broke some kind of dam. Emma called me that evening, and I'll remember that call for a long time too. "Dan," she said, and I could tell from her voice immediately that this conversation wouldn't be easy. "Who is that girl?" "Her name is Sophie," I said calmly. "We're together." "Together," Emma repeated. Pause. "Since when?" "About a month." "A month." Another pause, and in this pause, I heard something shift in her voice. "Dan, I don't understand. Not long ago, you were telling me you loved me. Not long ago. You were sitting across from me at the Bobcat, saying those things. And now, a month later, you're already with some girl from a pottery studio?" And that's when something happened that I'll admit honestly, did not foresee. Emma was upset, genuinely, not politely, not correctly, but so that her voice wavered. "I thought you would be," she faltered. "I don't know what I thought. I guess I thought you'd be there, always. That even if things didn't work out between us the way you wanted, you'd still be my Dan. The one I could call at 2 a.m, the one who would always understand." Her voice faded completely. "And now I look at that photo, and I realize that you're looking at her the way you never looked at me. And it hurts me somehow, and I don't even have the right to this hurt, and that makes it even worse." I was silent, not because I didn't have words, but because I needed to choose them carefully. Because here's the truth. A year ago, this call would have destroyed me. A year ago, I would have heard in Emma Reyes's wavering voice the long-awaited sign, latched onto it, and started rebuilding my endless blueprint. She's upset. That means I have a chance. But I wasn't that person anymore. And more importantly, I had finally understood one simple and slightly sad thing. "Emma," I said gently, "can I be honest?" "Yes. It's not that you love me that hurts. It's that I stopped waiting." I spoke quietly, without reproach, because there was nothing to reproach. "For 4 years, you had a person who was always there, no matter what. It's very convenient to have a person like that. It's like knowing that there's always a light on at home, even if you're never there yourself. And now you've come home, and the light is off, and it feels strange and chilly. But that's not love, Emma. That's a habit of being loved." There was silence on the line. "Maybe you're right," Emma finally said, very quietly. "That sounds horrible, but maybe you're right." "It's not horrible," I said. "It's just human. We all want a light on somewhere. It's not fair to keep someone's light on only for yourself while you live in another house." "When did you get so wise?" Emma either sniffled or laughed. "I'm not wise," I said honestly. "I was just very unhappy 2 months ago, and I had a lot of time to think. Unhappiness. It's, unfortunately, educational." Emma and I met one more time, to truly say goodbye, not to our friendship, but to the old, wrong version of that friendship, in which I hadn't been a friend but something like a free utility. We sat, the universe couldn't resist the irony again, in that very Bobcat coffee shop. The espresso machine made the same dying whale sound. I think that's just its way of saying hello. "I want to apologize," said Emma, wrapping her hands around her cup. "I thought a lot after our conversation, and I realized that I really did use you for 4 years, Dan. Not on purpose. I would never have done it on purpose, you know that. But the fact that it wasn't on purpose didn't make it any easier for you." "No," I agreed. Lying was pointless, and Emma deserved honesty. "I'm sorry." She looked me in the eye. You're like a brother to me. For all those Brads and Tylers whose dates I made you drive me to. For keeping you close because it felt good and convenient that someone loved me like that. It was selfish. I'm sorry." "I forgive you," I said, and it was the pure truth. Forgiving turned out to be surprisingly easy because the splinter that would have made forgiveness hard was no longer in my chest. But forgive me too. I was guilty too. Not once in 4 years did I honestly tell you what I wanted. I just silently waited and silently resented you for not guessing. That's not a fair game, resenting someone for not reading your mind. So we're probably both a piece of work. Emma smiled, a little sadly, but it was a real, clean smile. She suits you, she said. Sophie. I looked at your photos. Yes, I know it's pathetic, but I looked. And Dan, you're different in them. You're not waiting in them. You're just there. And you're happy. She's great, I said, and I could hear how stupidly and happily it sounded. She's a terrible cook, Emma. Just catastrophically bad. Once, she managed to burn water. I still don't understand the physics of that process. Emma laughed, for the first time in the whole conversation, genuinely. Take care of her, she said, both the one who can burn water and you who's idiotically happy about it. We walked out of the Bobcat and said goodbye on the corner of 5th and Maple. No drama, no scenes. Maybe someday we'll be friends again. Real, normal friends. Without hidden debts and unpaid balances. Or maybe not, and we'll just go our separate ways. Either one, I discovered with surprise, suited me just fine. A year has passed. I'm back at the Dirty Hands pottery studio, where it all began. Wednesday evening, smelling of wet clay and coffee, the light coming through the tall windows just right. Sophie is sitting at the neighboring wheel, making another mug. Over the past year, she's become significantly better as a potter. Her mugs are now almost always recognizably mugs, and she seems slightly disappointed by this fact, because the era of proud, ugly triumphs has come to an end. I haven't gotten better at all. I make mugs exactly as terribly as I did a year ago. It turns out this is my fundamental feature, my pottery destiny. Sophie says she loves me partly for this. It's nice to be the only person in the couple who can actually do something. We moved in together 4 months ago. I moved into her place. It's cozier, and Pythagoras is there. By now, he's officially accepted me as a member of the pack and sleeps on my feet, folding, as is his wont, into a perfect triangle. My ugly first mug still sits at Sophie's, that is, now ours, on the shelf, in the most honored place. Sophie says it's our family heirloom, the starting point. My parents adore Sophie, probably even more than me, and I'm not offended. I do the same in their place. Dad found in her the ideal listener for his historical sagas and started a tradition. Every Sunday, a new fort. Mom has finally decided the fate of that porcelain set and periodically drops phrases like, "when you finally," after which she pretends she didn't say anything. Marcus and Chloe clicked with Sophie instantly. Now I don't have 2 friends who see right through me, but 3. And sometimes I think that's too many. But it's a good too many. And recently, one thing happened that I'm essentially writing this epilogue for. We were having dinner at my parents', the 2 of us, Mom, Dad, Sunday, casserole. Dad had just reached the climax of his latest historical saga, and at some point, Mom looked at Sophie and me across the table. We were quietly giggling about some inside stupidity, and suddenly said, "You know, I was remembering the other day. Daniel, do you remember how over a year ago you first mentioned Sophie at this very table? Twice during dinner, once about a parrot." "I remember," I said. "I knew right away," said Mom, with unbearable maternal smugness. "That very second. I was just waiting for you to figure it out." And that's when Sophie, without letting go of my hand, turned to Mom and said with a completely serious face, "Oh, Mrs. Carter, don't worry. Waiting for Dan is normal. I spent 6 months luring him with clay at the pottery studio before he caught on. He's quick, but it takes him a while to get up to speed." The table burst out laughing. Dad laughed so hard he set aside his fort saga, and I sat there amid the laughter, holding Sophie's hand, thinking about what a ridiculous winding road had led me here. The Bobcat coffee shop, the great speech about friendship. You're like a brother to me. Marcus with his prescription, and Chloe with her pottery studio. The ugly mug. The Carter family Sunday tribunal. Dad's tomatoes. The rain, the awning, and the phrase I finally said out loud. Emma's call and her insane, unexpected reaction. The reaction of someone who suddenly discovered that the light that had always been on for her had finally gone out, because it had found someone to truly shine for. If someone had told me back then, in that coffee shop, that "you're like a brother to me" wasn't the end of my story but its beginning, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have thought they were mocking me. But that's exactly how it turned out. I was friend-zoned, and you know what? It was the best thing that could have happened to me. Because leaving someone else's waiting room, I finally walked forward and arrived where I was truly waited for. With clay under my fingernails, with a three-legged cat, with a woman who can burn water and laughs with a snort at the end. I wouldn't trade that road for anything in the world.
You said I was like a brother in a coffee shop at 5, and the machine behind the counter sounded just like I felt inside. 4 years of almost saying, 4 years of standing near. I built my whole life quietly around the chance you'd disappear into my arms, into some ending I had written in my head. But you smiled and called me safe instead. I said nothing would change, but I changed when I got home. Found my heart in the wreckage of a place I'd called my own. I'm not waiting anymore, not standing by the door, not keeping all my lights on for someone coming back no more. I was half alive before, always hoping you'd be sure. Then love found me laughing with clay on the floor. I'm not waiting anymore, I'm not waiting anymore. She made the ugliest mug and called it a little victory. Had clay on her hands and somehow still reached me. She laughed like open windows, like rain after the heat, like I didn't have to earn it, like I was enough to keep. No careful lines, no silent acting, no waiting for a sign. Just tacos, bad movies in her hand, close to mine. And my friend said don't go backwards. My mother saw right through, said son, don't miss the person who's already choosing you. I'm not waiting anymore, not standing by the door, not keeping all my lights on for someone coming back no more. I was half alive before, always hoping you'd be sure. Then love found me laughing with clay on the floor. I'm not waiting anymore, I'm not waiting anymore. And when the old name called me, I didn't run back blind. Some doors close so softly you don't hear them. At the time you weren't cruel, you weren't evil, you just like the light I gave. But I was never meant to live inside somebody else's waiting place. Now there's rain on the awning and her hands on my face. She says I've been waiting too, but it doesn't feel the same. I'm not waiting anymore, not aching like before, not calling almost love the thing I'm living for. I was lost outside myself, now I know what I deserve. Someone who says my name like I'm already hurt. I'm not waiting anymore, I'm not waiting anymore. On the shelf, three-legged cat by the door. She laughs and I remember what I was breathing for. I'm not waiting anymore.